Real insights, no noise. The K-Show.
And welcome to the K Show. I'm your host, K, and tonight we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal economic showdowns of our time, the US-China trade war. A battle that began in 2017 and is still echoing across boardrooms, factories, farms, and global power corridors well into 2025. Over the next hour, we'll trace the full arc of this high-stakes confrontation, from the sparks that ignited it to the tariffs that scorched supply chains, from the Phase 1 agreement to the tremors of the COVID-19 pandemic that reshaped the rules of engagement. We'll explore the fallout: steel, agriculture, semiconductors, electric vehicles, rare earths, no industry left untouched. And then we arrive at the present, March 2025, a moment many are now calling Liberation Day. President Trump back on center stage, unleashing a sweeping new wave of tariffs, sparking new divisions, new debates, and maybe a new era of global economic realignment. Throughout this episode, you'll hear it all. Verified data from Bloomberg, Brookings, Reuters, the WTO, sharp insights from the Economist, quotes from policymakers, CEOs, and even Reddit's sharpest minds. This is about clarity, not spin. Perspective, not noise. So by the end, we'll ask the real questions: who gained, who lost? Are we heading into a second phase of negotiation, or tumbling toward a deeper decoupling with global consequences? There's a lot to unpack. So, settle in, turn the volume up. This is the K Show, and the story starts now. To really understand the US-China trade war, we have to rewind to where it all began, back in 2017. That year, Donald Trump was sworn in as President of the United States, following a campaign that made trade a central theme. He didn't hold back. He blamed China for what he called the greatest theft in the history of the world, pointing to widespread allegations of intellectual property theft and an enormous trade deficit, which stood at around $346 billion in 2016. According to Trump, America was being taken advantage of, and he saw himself as the man to reverse that. He came into office promising to rewrite the rules and bring jobs back home. For many working-class Americans who felt left behind by globalization, that message hit home. In April 2017, just a few months into his presidency, Trump welcomed Chinese President Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago. The meeting was cordial enough, and out of it came what was called a 100-day action plan to jumpstart trade negotiations. China agreed to some small measures, like allowing more US beef imports and opening up a bit of its financial sector. But the changes, they were minimal. And as the months passed, it became clear. The deeper issues weren't being addressed. The White House began losing patience. By the summer of 2017, the tone had shifted. Behind closed doors, trade hardliners like U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and White House advisor Peter Navarro were laying the groundwork for a tougher response. And in August, the US launched a formal investigation into China's intellectual property practices. a move grounded in Section 301 of the Trade Act. That was a serious step. It signaled the administration wasn't just complaining anymore, it was preparing for action. Then came the tweet that made headlines around the world. In March 2018, Trump declared, "When a country, USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade wars are good and easy to win." Bold words, and they came alongside the announcement of new tariffs, 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, citing national security concerns. These weren't narrow, targeted measures. They hit allies and adversaries alike, Canada, the European Union, and yes, China. The message was unmistakable. Trump was ready to rattle cages, even if it meant upsetting traditional partners. In Beijing, officials were watching closely, and with growing concern. Publicly, they condemned the tariffs as a violation of global trade rules. Privately, they were hoping to de-escalate. But it was too late. By early April, the US released its findings from the Section 301 investigation, accusing China of widespread intellectual property theft and coercive trade practices. Trump followed that up with a threat: new tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. China responded immediately, promising to strike back with tariffs of their own. And just like that, the opening shots of the trade war had been fired. By August, the US doubled down, another $16 billion in tariffs. China answered with a mirror move. Now we were at $50 billion each, and counting. And this was still just the warm-up. The trade war went from simmering tension to open conflict in mid-2018. On July 6th, the United States fired the first major salvo, a 25% tariff on $34 billion worth of Chinese imports. Not just any goods, high-tech and industrial components. A direct hit on China's strategic manufacturing base. Beijing wasted no time. That very same day, China struck back with its own 25% tariffs on $34 billion of US goods. But this wasn't just economic policy, it was political targeting: soybeans, pork, corn. The goal? Inflict pain right where it hurt Trump most, America's rural heartland. Punch, counterpunch. This wasn't a spat, it was a duel with billion-dollar bullets. In September 2018, Trump escalated again, $200 billion more in Chinese goods, from electronics to furniture. Tariff rate, 10%, with a warning to raise it to 25% later. China, limited by the smaller size of US imports, responded $60 billion in tariffs at rates of 5 to 10%. By year's end, half of all Chinese goods entering the US were under some form of tariff, and nearly 70% of US exports to China were tariffed by Beijing. The front lines were shifting. The conflict spilled into tech. In 2018, the US effectively crippled Chinese telecom firm ZTE for violating sanctions. It was only saved by a White House brokered deal. The message was clear: Washington was ready to use weapons beyond tariffs. In 2019, it got even more serious. Huawei, China's tech crown jewel, was placed on an export blacklist. US firms could no longer sell chips, software, or components to Huawei without a license. National security, they said. But to Beijing, this was containment, pure and simple. A full-blown tech war was now underway. And yet, despite the blows, talks continued. In December 2018, at the G20 summit, Trump and Xi announced a 90-day truce. Markets exhaled, but by spring 2019, it all broke down. The US accused China of backtracking on reform commitments. In May, Trump escalated again, raising tariffs on that $200 billion batch from 10% to 25%. China fired back. $60 billion in US goods, now taxed as high as 25%. By September 2019, Trump unleashed another wave. 15% tariffs on $120 billion in Chinese consumer goods, clothing, electronics, shoes. This time, the pain hit American households. These weren't factory parts. These were back-to-school backpacks and dishwashers. China, running low on US goods to tax, changed tactics. The yuan weakened, making Chinese exports cheaper and dulling the bite of US tariffs. The US Treasury responded, labeling China a currency manipulator. Symbolic? Yes. Escalatory? Absolutely. By the end of 2019, the numbers painted a grim picture. $550 billion in Chinese imports hit by US tariffs, $185 billion in US goods taxed by China. This was now the biggest trade war in modern history, and the damage was mounting. US manufacturing stalled. Investment froze. Farm bankruptcies hit an 8-year high. Freight slowed. Production dipped. The Washington Post put it bluntly. Trump's actions amounted to one of the largest tax increases in years. Moody's estimated 300,000 US jobs lost, 0.3% of GDP gone. Bloomberg Economics projected a total GDP loss of $316 billion by 2020. The Fed found that market uncertainty and supply chain chaos cost US firms $1.7 trillion in value. This wasn't just a scrape, it was a self-inflicted wound, but China wasn't untouched. Growth fell to 6%, the slowest in decades. Factories closed. Global firms began looking elsewhere. And still, Trump stood firm. Trade wars are good and easy to win. At one point, he called tariff the most beautiful word in the English dictionary. He believed the short-term pain would yield long-term reform, that China would be forced to change, to end tech theft, to stop subsidies, to open markets. The question hanging in the air was, how do we de-escalate? And that answer came in January 2020, a ceasefire, a deal, a reset, or maybe just the illusion of one. But it wouldn't last, because what came next, no one saw coming. After nearly 2 years of escalation, Washington and Beijing struck a truce of sorts in January 2020. This Phase 1 trade deal was signed on January 15, 2020, and it paused the trade war from spiraling further, at least temporarily. What was in the deal? In short, China made big purchase commitments, and the US offered partial tariff relief. Under Phase 1, China agreed to buy an additional $200 billion of US goods and services over 2020-2021, above a 2017 baseline. This included ambitious targets, tens of billions more in US agriculture like soybeans, corn, and meat, energy such as LNG and crude oil, manufactured goods like aircraft and autos, and services. In the agricultural sector, China promised an extra $32 billion in 2 years, a huge boon if fulfilled, meant to please American farmers. On structural issues, Beijing also pledged to better protect US intellectual property, stop forcing foreign companies to transfer technology, and open up its financial services sector more. Importantly, China did not agree to curb key industrial subsidies. That thorny issue was kicked to a future negotiation. In exchange, the US called off some planned tariff increases. The Trump administration cancelled tariffs on roughly $160 billion of Chinese consumer goods that had been scheduled for December 2019 and halved the tariff rate on about $120 billion of imports that had been imposed in September 2019. However, steep tariffs of 25% remained on roughly $250 billion of Chinese goods, mostly industrial and intermediate products. Even after Phase 1, about 2/3 of Chinese exports to the US were still under tariff, and nearly all retaliatory Chinese tariffs on US goods stayed in place, though China granted some exemptions to facilitate its promised purchases. Phase 1 was a partial truce, not a full peace treaty. The deal included an enforcement mechanism, regular consultations, and a clause that if China didn't meet targets or uphold commitments, the US could respond by reimposing tariffs. Critics noted the deal's centerpiece was purchase targets, effectively managed trade, which many were skeptical China could meet, even in the best of times. Soon after the deal took effect in February 2020, an unforeseen shock upended everything: the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus outbreak, which started in China and spread globally, caused economic chaos. China's economy virtually shut down in early 2020 due to lockdowns, and US demand for some goods like energy collapsed as well. This made the purchase targets of Phase 1 even more unrealistic. By the end of 2021, independent analysis showed China had bought only about 57 to 60% of the US goods it had promised under the deal. For instance, China fell dramatically short on US energy purchases, only roughly 40 to 50% of the goal, and also missed agricultural and manufactured goods targets. In absolute terms, China's imports of US goods did increase from the trade war lows, benefiting American soybean farmers and other exporters, but not by the extraordinary amount advertised. In February 2022, President Biden's officials openly criticized Beijing for failing to beat the Phase 1 commitments, saying patience was wearing thin and urging concrete action from China to close the gap. China, however, cited the pandemic and global conditions as excuses, and no additional purchases were forthcoming. Politically, Trump hailed Phase 1 as the biggest deal ever seen, and evidence his hardball tactics paid off. It did provide some relief to US farmers. China ramped up soybean and corn imports in 2020, helping Midwest prices, and it calmed markets that feared endless escalation. But Phase 1 did not resolve the core issues. Key structural problems like China's massive industrial subsidies, state control of the economy, and cybersecurity threats were left to a Phase 2 that never happened. Analysts noted that the costs of the trade war far outweighed the limited benefits, and the bilateral relationship remained fraught. Moreover, the goodwill from the deal was short-lived. Within weeks of signing, the world was engulfed by COVID-19. Instead of negotiating Phase 2, the Trump administration's attention turned to the pandemic, and notably blaming China for the virus. US-China relations worsened in other arenas, including the closure of consulates on both sides. By the end of 2020, whatever fragile trust existed had evaporated. Donald Trump lost the November 2020 US presidential election, but before leaving office he took one parting shot: banning Americans from investing in certain Chinese companies tied to the military. The trade war's tariffs, however, he left in place as leverage for his successor. The year 2020 was dominated by the coronavirus pandemic, which caused the sharpest global recession since World War II. The trade war understandably took a back seat in headlines. However, its effects continued and even interacted with the pandemic's disruptions. In the initial lockdown phase, global trade volumes plummeted. Factories in China shut down, snarling supply chains for US companies, and US consumer demand shifted. More demand for masks and medical supplies, less for cars and so forth. Interestingly, even amid tensions, China exported vast amounts of medical gear to the US in 2020, such as masks and gloves, highlighting how interdependent the two economies still were. The tariffs on those items were sometimes waived to facilitate pandemic response. Politically, though, COVID-19 drove the US and China further apart. President Trump took to calling the coronavirus the China virus, and in May 2020, he said the Phase 1 deal meant much less to me in light of the pandemic's toll. Both countries increasingly saw each other as strategic adversaries, not partners. The trade war morphed into a broader strategic competition. In January 2021, a new US president took office, Joe Biden. Many wondered if Biden would unwind Trump's tariffs to repair ties or lower costs for American importers. But in a notable display of continuity, President Biden did not lift the Trump-era tariffs on China, at least not initially. He faced domestic political pressures to remain tough on Beijing. Instead, the Biden administration launched a review of the tariffs and their impact, and focused on enforcing Phase 1. By early 2022, as we noted, Biden's team was publicly calling out China for not meeting purchase commitments. US officials acknowledged Phase 1 did not address the core problems with China's state-led economy, even as they demanded Beijing at least fulfill the deal it signed. Privately, many in the Biden administration viewed the tariffs as leverage to use in dealing with China. They didn't want to give it away without something in return. Biden's strategy diverged from Trump's in style. He sought to work more closely with allies and pursue a more targeted approach, but not in overall toughness. In late 2021, the U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai described the strategy as invest, align, and compete. Invest in American competitiveness, align with allies, and compete with China fiercely. The U.S. made some fixes with allies. For example, in late 2021, Biden struck a deal with the EU to ease the steel and aluminum tariffs, converting them into a quota system, and resolved a long Boeing-Airbus aircraft subsidy dispute, presenting a united front with Europe. But with China, Biden's team essentially kept the pressure on. There were a few diplomatic talks, like a call between Biden and Xi, and lower-level dialogues, but no tariff rollback. The trade war tariffs thus remained in force throughout Biden's term, and U.S. importers continued to pay those taxes. By 2021, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods was around 19%, up from 3% before the war. For context, that's astronomically high by recent standards, though still below Smoot-Hawley tariff levels of the 1930s. China kept its retaliatory tariffs too, though it periodically exempted or reduced tariffs on certain items to stabilize its economy, for instance, cutting tariffs on some pork and consumer goods to tame inflation. One interesting twist: despite the tariffs, US-China goods trade in 2021 rebounded strongly from the 2020 slump. In fact, 2021 saw record trade flows. American consumers, flush with stimulus money, splurged on imported goods during the pandemic recovery, and many of those goods were still made in China, even if slightly costlier due to tariffs. The US trade deficit with China, which had dipped in 2019-2020, widened again in 2021-22. In other words, the tariffs did not achieve Trump's goal of closing the trade gap. American demand largely shifted supply chains, but didn't eliminate the deficit. Meanwhile, the tech and investment war accelerated. The Biden administration imposed new sanctions on Chinese officials over human rights, maintained restrictions on Huawei, even pressuring allies not to use Huawei 5G gear, and expanded a Trump-era ban on Americans investing in Chinese companies linked to defense or surveillance. Trust between Washington and Beijing was at a low ebb, especially after incidents like a suspected Chinese spy balloon over US territory in early 2023. By 2022, the trade war, in the narrow sense, had settled into a new normal of high tariffs and distrust. Phase 1 was essentially the ceasefire holding the line, but no progress was made toward a broader Phase 2 settlement. Both the US and China adapted to the tariffs rather than removing them. American firms figured out how to cope, some by shifting supply chains, some by passing costs to consumers. Chinese exporters often absorbed part of the tariff cost by lowering prices. The economic relationship limped along under tariffs, awaiting either a major break or a breakthrough. Little did anyone know that by 2025 things would break again, dramatically on Liberation Day. But before we get to that climax, we need to discuss another front of this conflict, the technology war. If tariffs were the hammer of the trade war, technology became the new battleground for US-China rivalry. Starting in 2018 and escalating through 2023, the US took unprecedented steps to curb China's technological rise, especially in advanced semiconductors, telecommunications, 5G networks, and other cutting-edge sectors like artificial intelligence. This tech war often ran parallel to the tariff fight, reinforcing an overall trend toward decoupling. We already mentioned how the US banned Huawei and ZTE from its telecom networks and cut them off from US suppliers. Huawei, once the world's second-largest smartphone maker, saw its global phone sales plummet after losing access to Google's Android system and high-end chips. In 2019, Huawei's founder, Ren Zhengfei, lamented that the US blacklist was causing serious difficulties for the company, as its international business was being attacked and its supply of key parts disrupted. Meanwhile, China was furious. Huawei is a national champion, and the Chinese government viewed its treatment as a direct attack on China's innovation. Under President Biden, the tech war only intensified, but in a more systematic way. October 7, 2022 became a milestone. On that day, the US Commerce Department enacted sweeping export controls on semiconductor technology to China. These rules barred the export of advanced chips and the equipment to make them if those chips could be used in supercomputing or military applications. For example, cutting-edge logic chips above certain performance thresholds could no longer be sold to Chinese firms no matter who made them if US technology was involved. This effectively meant firms in allied countries too, like Taiwan's TSMC or the Netherlands' ASML, had to stop service to Chinese clients for high-end tech because US tooling and IP are ubiquitous in chip making. One headline described these measures as aiming to strangle with an intent to kill China's advanced chip development, quoting an expert horrified by the breadth of controls. The US also required that Americans working in China's semiconductor industry quit their jobs or lose US citizenship, a stunning restriction that reportedly crippled some Chinese chip projects overnight by pulling out skilled personnel. Beijing, for its part, had been investing billions to build a domestic semiconductor industry through its Made in China 2025 plan and other initiatives, precisely to reduce reliance on Western tech. But catching up in chips is hard. As of 2025, China still lags a few generations behind in cutting-edge logic chips, although its top chip maker, SMIC, surprised observers by producing a 7-nanometer chip, still a couple of generations behind the 3-nanometer state-of-the-art. The US aims to keep it that way, enforcing what some call a silicon curtain to block China from obtaining the most advanced AI chips or the tools to make them. The Biden administration even got allies on board. By early 2023, the Netherlands and Japan, key equipment makers, agreed in principle to align their export restrictions with the US, closing loopholes that China could exploit. The tech decoupling goes beyond chips. The US has also clamped down on Chinese apps, though more through bans on government devices and pressure campaigns. TikTok, the wildly popular short video app owned by China's ByteDance, was banned from US government phones over data security fears, and there were ongoing threats of a nationwide ban or a forced sale. On China's side, new laws signaled that if the US hurts Chinese interests, Beijing can retaliate by sanctioning US entities and controlling vital data exports. China also started blacklisting or investigating US companies operating in China. In 2023, China's cyber regulator effectively banned US chipmaker Micron's products in critical infrastructure projects, citing security risks, widely seen as retaliation for the US chip controls. The tech war has huge long-term implications. It has spurred the US to invest at home. For example, the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 set aside over $50 billion in subsidies to build new semiconductor fabs in the US. TSMC and Samsung are now building major plants in Arizona and Texas. It also pushed companies to redesign supply chains to exclude China for high-end products. Apple notably started moving some iPhone assembly to India and Vietnam and considered shifting its chip production reliance away from Taiwan to avoid future cross-strait crises. China, in turn, doubled down on self-reliance, pouring money into indigenous chip R&D, quantum computing, and alternative chip architectures. President Xi Jinping frequently calls for China to win the battle in core technologies and not be strangled by foreign countries. In essence, the trade war bled into a tech war where both superpowers are racing to secure supply chains for critical technologies, from 5G equipment and AI chips to rare earth minerals. It's not just about economics, it's also about national security and military power. Advanced semiconductors are in fighter jets and missile systems. Rare earths are in missile guidance and EV motors. Both sides see tech dominance as vital. We should note that the WTO and global trade rules were ill-equipped to handle this tech decoupling. Export controls and national security exemptions lie outside typical tariff disciplines. The WTO can and did rule on tariffs. In September 2020, a WTO panel decided that Trump's China-specific tariffs violated WTO rules because they weren't even claiming a valid WTO exception. The US tried to justify them under a vague public morals clause, which the panel rejected. But on tech sanctions, the WTO has little say. National security is usually not justiciable. By 2025, we effectively see two technology spheres emerging. One sphere, US-led, has companies like Apple, Qualcomm, TSMC, and ASML using Western-aligned standards with supply chains avoiding Chinese inputs. The other sphere, China-led, strives to develop indigenous versions, such as Huawei's Harmony OS for phones or China's Beidou satellite navigation system, and relies on domestic or friendly suppliers. There is overlap, but it is shrinking. This tech bifurcation is a direct result of actions taken during the trade war period.
From the very start, China targeted U.S. farmers in retaliation, knowing they were a core part of Trump's support base. In July 2018, when China slapped tariffs on soybeans, America's largest export to China, it was a gut punch to Midwest farmers. Almost overnight, U.S. soy exports to China plummeted by about 50% in volume in 2018. Piles of unsold soybeans accumulated in silos. Prices fell so much that the U.S. government had to intervene with enormous aid. By 2019, the Trump administration rolled out farm bailout packages totaling around $28 billion to compensate farmers for lost sales, a scale of aid on par with the 2009 auto bailout. One soybean farmer quipped that their largest customer had become Uncle Sam instead of China. Take Brad Kramer, a Wisconsin soybean farmer, who in late 2018 said, "The tariff situation has sucked the wind out of farmer sales. We spent 20 years building the Chinese market for our soybeans. That's gone overnight." Indeed, China turned to Brazil and Argentina for soy and to Europe for pork during the trade war. U.S. exports of soybeans to China fell to $3.1 billion in 2018 from $12.2 billion in 2017, before recovering partially later. Many farm bankruptcies resulted. The American Farm Bureau reported a sharp rise in 2018 and 2019. Phase 1 in 2020 was supposed to rescue the farmers by compelling China to buy big again. China did increase purchases of U.S. agriculture in 2020 to 21, importing record amounts of corn and pork, partly due to its own domestic swine flu outbreak. By 2021, China bought about $37 billion in U.S. agricultural products, its highest ever, but this was still short of the Phase 1 target. While soybean and meat exports surged, other products like ethanol and certain fruits lagged. Farmers were grateful for the renewed sales but wary. They had learned how vulnerable it is to rely on one big market. Even as the US and China traded again, Beijing diversified its food sourcing, signing huge long-term contracts for Brazilian soy. By 2025, US farmers remained nervous pawns in the trade chess game. When news of Trump's Liberation Day tariffs came, farmers feared China would retaliate on agriculture yet again, and indeed Beijing did threaten more farm tariffs. One twist is that global markets have somewhat adjusted. New buyers and suppliers have emerged. Brazil became the top soybean supplier to China during the trade war and retains that role. The U.S. share of China's soybean market lost in 2018 to 2019 hasn't fully recovered, making those tariffs a longer-term loss for U.S. agriculture. In short, American agriculture was hit hard by the trade war, lost market share, financial stress, mental health strain, and only partially recovered with government aid and China's later buying. It's a classic example of the lose-lose aspect of the conflict. Chinese importers paid higher prices or scrambled for alternate sources, while U.S. farmers suffered steep losses. One of Trump's main aims was to rejuvenate U.S. manufacturing, and a cornerstone was protecting industries like steel. In March 2018, when he imposed the 25% steel tariff and a 10% aluminum tariff globally, it was cheered by American steel mills. Indeed, in the short term, those tariffs led to some positives for steelmakers. U.S. steel production ticked up, prices rose, and companies like U.S. Steel even announced restarts of some blast furnaces. Steelworker jobs saw a modest increase or at least a stabilizing. In 2018, for example, U.S. Steel reopened a mill in Illinois, citing the tariffs and called back workers. However, for the broader manufacturing sector, the picture was mixed. Steel-using industries, automakers, machinery, construction suddenly faced higher input costs. The American Automotive Policy Council warned that the tariffs would add hundreds of dollars to the cost of each car. A 2019 study by Economist found that industries using steel lost jobs because the tariffs raised their costs more than any protection saved jobs in steel production. By late 2019, U.S. manufacturing was in a slump. The manufacturing PMI hit its lowest since 2009, and sectors like farm equipment and freight trucking were in recession. The Federal Reserve concluded in a report that manufacturing employment growth was 18,000 jobs lower by the end of 2019 than it would have been without the trade war, as losses in industries facing tariffs or retaliation outweighed gains in protected sectors. One clear example, Harley-Davidson, the iconic motorcycle maker, was hit from both sides, higher steel costs in the US and retaliatory EU tariffs on its bikes. In mid-2018, Harley announced it would shift some production overseas to avoid EU tariffs, undercutting Trump's goal of manufacturing in America. Trump angrily tweeted about Harley, but the company had bottom-line reasons. Protectionism ricocheted unpredictably.
And what about autos? While Trump often threatened a big tariff on imported cars, especially targeting Europe and Japan, he held off during his first term, using it as leverage in trade negotiations. However, as of 2025 in the Liberation Day scenario, a 25% tariff on imported vehicles and parts was finally enacted. This is huge.
Major automakers like Toyota, BMW, and Ford, for its Mexican-made cars, suddenly faced a shock. Economists predict that a 25% auto tariff would raise U.S. car prices dramatically by several $1,000s on average, and could cost tens of thousands of American auto dealer and manufacturing jobs if sales slump or if U.S.-built cars relying on imported parts become more expensive. It's a highly controversial measure. We saw that even Trump's team gave a one-month exemption on those tariffs for Canada and Mexico's auto exports after auto industry lobbying. Manufacturing supply chains are so integrated across borders that blanket tariffs can boomerang. To sum up, U.S. manufacturing did not experience the renaissance promised. Certain factories benefited from protective tariffs, but many others suffered from higher input costs and lost export markets. By 2019, U.S. manufacturing output was slightly lower than in 2018, and industries like appliances saw chaos when a 20% tariff on imported washing machines early in 2018 led to a 12% price hike on washers and even dryers, hurting consumers without a big employment boost. Consumers essentially paid a tax for domestic industry protection. A representative of a Midwest manufacturing association noted in summer 2019, "Our members appreciate the intent to help American industry, but the tariffs are causing supply chain disruptions and cost increases that make many of us less competitive." It's a Pyrrhic victory. That sentiment was common in the broader manufacturing sector. U.S. semiconductor companies like Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, and NVIDIA have been caught in the middle. China is a huge market for chips, by some measures about one-third of global semiconductor demand. So when the US restricted sales to Chinese companies like Huawei, it hurt those US chip suppliers. For instance, Qualcomm lost lucrative orders for smartphone modems, and memory makers like Micron saw dips when China retaliated by favoring South Korean or domestic suppliers. On the flip side, the geopolitical rift spurred some positive outcomes for US chip making. It raised awareness that relying too much on Asian manufacturing was a security risk. This paved the way for legislation like the CHIPS Act to bolster domestic production of chips. By 2025, new US fabs are being built with government incentives. In Arizona, a massive $12 billion TSMC factory is under construction, using Taiwanese know-how to reduce reliance on Taiwan itself. This shift creates more regional redundancy in the chip supply. For China's chip sector, the trade war period has been a trial by fire. Chinese companies were cut off from leading-edge tools, which set them back, but it also galvanized a huge state effort to innovate around US restrictions. Huawei refocused on designing chips that could be made with older generation technology or invested in alternative chip designs. SMIC, China's foundry, sanctioned as well, still managed to produce a 7nm chip by tweaking older equipment. In memory chips, Chinese firms are trying to catch up with US, Korean, and Japanese rivals, though new export controls targeted them to block advanced equipment. Long-term, semiconductors may see two separate innovation tracks, one in the West and one in China, with limited cross-pollination. This is globally inefficient, but considered necessary for security by both sides. US semiconductor firms still lead in design, but they have lost a share of the Chinese market. NVIDIA, for example, can no longer sell its top AI chips to Chinese cloud companies. It created a downgraded version to comply with rules. These companies fear losing out on China's fast-growing AI market, while also recognizing the need to protect intellectual property and long-term dominance. The auto industry was already touched on, but electric vehicles and batteries deserve special focus. China is the world's largest EV market and the leading producer of lithium-ion batteries. Companies like CATL and BYD in China supply a huge share of EV batteries globally, and China refines the majority of critical battery minerals like lithium and cobalt. During the trade war, EVs and batteries became a subset of the tech war. The US identified the clean energy supply chain as a strategic vulnerability. Depending on China for batteries and materials could be risky. In 2018 to 2019, tariffs were placed on Chinese EVs and battery components, and China retaliated on US autos and parts. Tesla, notably, was caught in between. It manufactures in both the US and China. Tariffs made Tesla's imported cars pricier until it built a gigafactory in Shanghai, which started production in late 2019. That move avoided Chinese tariffs and ironically accelerated Tesla's investment in China, while pushing Chinese EV makers to look abroad. Chinese companies like NIO, XPeng, and BYD initially focused on their domestic EV market, but then expanded to Europe. The US market, however, was largely out of reach due to high tariffs. As for batteries, in 2018 the US imposed tariffs on imported Chinese battery components, spurring investment in domestic production. By 2022, multiple battery gigafactory projects in the US were announced, often joint ventures with Korean or Japanese firms. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 encouraged EV production in North America by restricting tax credits to vehicles built with regional content. This non-tariff strategy to friendshore the EV supply chain reflects lessons from the trade war. Rather than relying purely on tariffs, the US used industrial policy to reduce dependence on China.
Meanwhile, China's EV industry boomed behind its own tariff walls and government subsidies. By 2025, Chinese consumers have many domestic EV brands, and China is starting to export cheaper EVs to developing countries and Europe. The trade war insulated China's EV market, allowing local champions to flourish. Now those champions could become competitive threats globally.
Rare earth elements, 17 critical minerals used in electronics, defense systems, and renewable technologies, are another strategic battleground. China controls about 80% of the world's rare earth refining capacity. This has been its quiet ace card. Back in 2010, China briefly restricted rare earth exports to Japan, causing a price spike and highlighting global dependency. During the U.S. China trade war, there were hints that China might weaponize rare earth exports again. In May 2019, China's president visited a rare earth facility, viewed as a warning to the U.S. Fast forward to March/April 2025, China pulled the rare earth card as retaliation for Liberation Day tariffs, announcing tighter export controls on key rare earth metals. This move shook up the global supply of critical materials. Industries from EV makers to defense contractors scrambled. A U.S. defense official noted, "China's rare earth curbs are a wake-up call. We can't afford to depend on an adversary for critical materials in our jets and missiles." Prices of certain rare earths spiked, and companies with stockpiles drew them down. Nations like the U.S. and Australia began exploring emergency measures to boost alternative supplies. While the U.S., EU, and Japan launched programs to develop rare earth supply chains outside China, those efforts are still ramping up. China's near monopoly remains largely intact, giving it potent leverage.
Each sector's story reveals the broad ramifications of the US-China trade war. Farmers experienced lost market share and needed government bailouts. Manufacturers wrestled with higher costs and retaliatory barriers. The semiconductor industry faced revenue losses from blacklists even as it tried to secure its long-term technology leadership. Electric vehicle and battery supply chains are being reconfigured on both sides, and rare earth minerals emerged as a key pressure point. The trade war's ripple effects continue to influence investment decisions, government policies, and global supply chains. As we've seen, no single industry has gone untouched. One of the key terms that emerged from the trade war and later the pandemic is supply chain reconfiguration, essentially companies rethinking where they source and produce goods. The US-China trade war was a huge motivator for this shift. When faced with tariffs of 10%, 25% or more on Chinese-made goods, companies looked for ways to mitigate costs. Some raised prices to pass costs on to US consumers. Others absorbed the cost by squeezing margins or pushing suppliers for discounts. But a significant number decided to move production out of China to avoid tariffs, a strategy often dubbed China Plus One, meaning they keep some operations in China but add at least one other location. By 2019, these changes became visible in trade data. Vietnam's exports to the United States surged, rising over 35% year-on-year as companies shifted manufacturing of electronics peripherals, furniture, and apparel from China to Vietnam. GoPro moved most of its US-bound camera production out of China to Guadalajara, Mexico. Hasbro started sourcing fewer toys from China and more from India and Vietnam. Apple, one of the most high-profile examples, began pilot production of AirPods in Vietnam and later started assembling some iPhones in India through contractors like Foxconn. Although Apple's core assembly remained in China, this was a significant break from its previous all-in-China approach. An executive at a supply chain firm remarked in 2019, "Virtually every US client we have that made stuff in China is asking us about Vietnam, India, or Mexico." The tariffs were the final push they needed to diversify. This trend is often called decoupling, referring to the unwinding of tightly intertwined US-China supply chains. It doesn't happen overnight. Factories are expensive, and building new supplier bases takes time. Still, new supply hubs gained from China's losses. Besides Vietnam, Mexico benefited due to its proximity to the US and duty-free access under USMCA. Mexico's exports of electronics and machinery to the US increased as manufacturers found nearshoring, bringing production closer to the US, attractive for minimizing tariff and shipping risks.
A World Bank report in 2020 estimated that about 16% of manufacturing exports that China lost because of U.S. tariffs were picked up by other countries, with Vietnam, Mexico, Taiwan, and Cambodia among the winners. However, about half of the tariffs' impact simply meant higher costs passed on to U.S. importers or consumers, rather than genuine relocation in the short run. For many companies, moving had its own expenses, finding new suppliers, ensuring quality, so they could only justify relocating if tariffs seemed long-lasting. By 2019, those tariffs did indeed seem permanent. Then COVID-19 arrived, delivering another shock to supply chain planning. The pandemic caused disruptions across China when cities locked down and factories halted. Later, shipping bottlenecks produced delays lasting up to a year. This reinforced the idea that relying on a single country for cost or convenience could be risky. Even companies not directly affected by tariffs began fortifying their supply chains and building more redundancy. The term friendshoring emerged, meaning sourcing materials and goods from countries that are political allies or at least not adversaries. The goal is to reduce risk by aligning economic ties with strategic relationships. By 2025, we're witnessing a more fragmented global manufacturing landscape. It's not the end of globalization, but it's a different pattern. Southeast Asia plays a larger role, with Vietnam now a major electronics exporter, and Indonesia and Malaysia also gaining in manufacturing. India, with its vast workforce, has attracted more electronics assembly, notably with Apple suppliers ramping up iPhone assembly to perhaps 5 to 7% of all iPhones, with plans for more. Mexico and Canada have become even more integrated with U.S. production for everything from cars to appliances, thanks to nearshoring and an updated USMCA deal that incentivizes North American content. Meanwhile, Europe quietly diversified away from China in certain sectors, partly due to concerns of overdependence and the example of U.S. decoupling. European fashion brands, for instance, shifted some sourcing from China to Turkey or North Africa to be closer to home. Despite these shifts, China remains a manufacturing giant for many products. What has changed is that China's share of new investment in low-cost manufacturing is declining. Companies aren't shutting down Chinese plants en masse. Many factories there are efficient and already amortized, but they're choosing other locales when expanding or launching new products. China itself is moving up the value chain, focusing less on cheap toys and textiles and more on high-tech goods and its own huge domestic market. In response, China has worked to become more self-reliant, mirroring the U.S. approach in reverse. Beijing's dual circulation strategy, introduced in 2020, aims to boost domestic consumption and localize supply in critical sectors so the economy is less vulnerable to external shocks like tariffs. The country invested heavily in domestic semiconductor equipment to replace U.S. tools, encouraged local sourcing of components in industries like aerospace and telecom, and promoted using homegrown products in government procurement to reduce reliance on foreign brands. On the global policy front, countries have formed new alliances or frameworks focused on secure and resilient supply chains. The U.S. launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in 2022 with partners such as Japan, India, and Australia, emphasizing supply chain cooperation rather than traditional market access deals. The Quad, comprising the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, set up working groups on tech supply chains. The European Union launched its Global Gateway plan and a raw materials strategy to lessen dependence on China for critical inputs like lithium and rare earths. Economics and security are now tightly intertwined, and supply chain shifts reflect this new reality. In essence, the trade war kicked off a gradual decoupling. While not total, by 2025 the trend is clear. Companies are more cautious about concentrating manufacturing in China, and governments are actively shaping where critical goods originate. This reconfiguration is reshaping globalization, evolving from a single, integrated world market to something more regional or bloc-oriented among like-minded nations. Some observers call it a bifurcation of the global economy. All these changes set the stage for the latest drama. If tariffs of 10 to 25% were enough to spark these shifts, What happens when a new wave of even bigger tariffs hits nearly everything? That scenario began unfolding in March, April 2025. It's time to discuss what has been labeled Liberation Day.
Welcome to our deep dive into the events of early 2025. By that time, the trade war seemed locked in a tense holding pattern. Tariffs were still in place, tech restrictions continued expanding, yet there were no major flare-ups for a couple of years. That changed dramatically on April 2, 2025, a date President Donald Trump, now out of office but once again a powerful political figure, dubbed Liberation Day. At a rally-turned-press conference in the White House Rose Garden, he announced the most sweeping set of tariffs in American history. Trump proclaimed these measures a declaration of economic independence for the United States. Flanked by steelworkers and farmers, he declared, "For years, hard-working American citizens were forced to sit on the sidelines as other nations got rich and powerful, much of it at our expense. Now it's our turn to prosper." The plan imposed a universal tariff of 10% on all imports into the United States, with reciprocal rates on top for countries that America deemed had unfair trade advantages. It was effectively the tariff equivalent of a nuclear shock. Trump argued no other country could complain because he was just matching what they do. "I've decided for purposes of fairness that I will charge a reciprocal tariff. It's fair to all. No other country can complain," he said. In practice, this meant different tariff rates for different countries, a direct violation of the WTO's most favored nation rule. But Trump didn't mind. He cast it as putting America first and punishing cheaters. Let's break down the Liberation Day tariffs concretely. 10% baseline tariff on every import. This was across the board, sparing only a handful of countries. Reportedly, neighbors Canada and Mexico, plus perhaps a few strategic allies, got temporary exemptions or delays, likely to avoid immediate chaos under USMCA and other agreements. But even they were not fully spared, as we'll see. Higher tariffs on 57 countries and entities that run big trade surpluses with the US or have higher tariffs on US goods. China was target number one here. According to a CNBC report from that day, Chinese imports would face an additional 34% tariff on top of the 10%, effectively a 44% tariff on Chinese goods. Some sources even said 54% total, likely accounting for earlier tariffs still in place on certain goods. Either way, it meant virtually all Chinese products were now about half more expensive for US buyers. Other nations singled out included Germany and Japan for their surpluses and alleged currency manipulation, India for high tariffs on US goods, and Vietnam, ironically, a beneficiary of earlier diversion, now hit because of its surplus. Many developing countries that once enjoyed duty-free or low tariff access suddenly had US tariffs in the teens or higher. Even allies like South Korea and Italy were on the list if they had sectoral disputes. One trade lawyer observed, "It's the return of Smoot-Hawley, but on steroids." 25% tariff on autos and auto parts globally. Trump had always wanted this. He viewed European and Japanese cars as a threat. Now it was reality. Any foreign-made car or car part faced a hefty tax entering the US. This particularly hit the EU, Germany's BMW, Mercedes, VW, and Japan, Toyota, Honda, and even US Big Three automakers who rely on parts from Mexico or Canada or make certain models abroad. To placate USA, Canada and Mexico were told their autos had a 1-month exemption, basically a warning period. Still, they were not fully off the hook in the plan. Tariffs as sanctions. Trump also linked tariffs to non-trade issues. He imposed a 25% tariff on all goods from Mexico unless Mexico further helped stop illegal immigration and drug trafficking. He justified this under a claimed emergency, blending migration policy with trade. Similarly, there was mention of a tariff on countries dealing with Venezuela's oil, specifically a 25% levy on those importing Venezuelan oil, which included Chinese and Indian refineries. The The legal basis cited was national security and counter-narcotics. Legal basis. He did all of this via a series of executive orders invoking broad statutes. One was the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, citing national security. Another was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. He declared a national emergency over fentanyl and trade cheating, giving power to restrict imports. The White House also dusted off the idea of the Reciprocal Trade Act. This was legally contentious. Many experts said it violated Congress's constitutional power over tariffs, but the administration forged ahead, daring anyone to sue while the tariffs took effect immediately or within days. Immediate reactions at home and abroad. China blasted the move. The Foreign Ministry called it a serious violation of WTO rules and said the US was undermining the multilateral trading system. Beijing painted the US as a bully and itself as a defender of free trade. Chinese officials vowed countermeasures. Within a day, China announced it would impose a matching 34% tariff on all imports from the US starting April 10th, on top of existing duties, essentially closing the Chinese market further to many US firms. Beijing also specifically restricted exports of rare earth metals, a targeted strike. Chinese state media revived nationalistic slogans about resisting American pressure, and there were reports that China could even limit sales of certain pharmaceuticals or other critical goods to the US if things worsened. Allies and other countries were livid at being caught in the crossfire. The EU's Trade Commissioner decried the US move as totally unacceptable and hinted at a WTO challenge and retaliatory tariffs. The French finance minister implored the US to be cooperative instead of confrontational. Japan's government was taken aback, with officials quietly negotiating exemptions behind the scenes. On Capitol Hill, even Republican senators from farm states and pro-trade Democrats blasted the indiscriminate nature of the tariffs. There were immediate lawsuits filed at the WTO by the EU, Japan, China, and others as a coalition, claiming the US had effectively demolished the most favored nation principle. But the WTO's appellate body was still crippled, so any legal victory was largely symbolic. The global mood was fear of a worldwide recession, breakdown of the trading system, and uncertainty about supply chains that had just begun recovering from COVID. Markets reacted swiftly and negatively. On April 3rd and 4th, 2025, US stock markets plunged. The Dow Jones average lost over 2,200 points, around 6 to 7% in 2 days, entering correction territory, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq fell into a bear market. Investors feared the tariffs would fuel inflation and choke growth. Warren Buffett noted that his conglomerate had hoarded cash and avoided big recent investments, a move that suddenly looked prescient as asset prices tumbled. Asian markets sank too. Japan's Nikkei and Hong Kong's Hang Seng each fell over 4% overnight. The Chinese yuan depreciated sharply, nearing its weakest levels in 15 years. Prices of industrial commodities like copper dropped, while safe haven assets like gold spiked. Economic forecasts turned pessimistic. Banks and think tanks quickly revised forecasts downward. Some predicted that if these tariffs stayed, US inflation could rise by 1-2 percentage points, and GDP growth could be cut by half or more for 2025, possibly tipping into a mild recession in 2026. The International Monetary Fund warned that global growth might be reduced by about 1.0 percentage point. Analysts said the hit to China's GDP could be around 0.5-0.8 percentage points, compounding existing challenges. Public opinion and politics in the US was sharply divided. Trump framed Liberation Day as a patriotic reclaiming of economic destiny, comparing it to Independence Day. His core base largely applauded the toughness. Polls showed a majority of Republican voters agreed tariffs were necessary to stop foreign exploitation. Some Americans, especially in manufacturing towns, celebrated, feeling that someone was finally protecting jobs. One rancher in Texas said, "I'm glad someone is finally standing up for the American producer. Hang tough, we can weather the short term." Trump himself urged Americans to hang tough and claimed any market turbulence was just medicine that the country had to take to get better. Beyond his base, however, there was widespread anxiety. Consumer advocacy groups warned that everyday prices would rise. The National Retail Federation called the tariffs a tax on Americans, estimating that the average family might pay thousands more a year. Manufacturers reliant on global inputs were furious. Many economists lamented the move, calling Trump's tariff math misguided. Even some former Trump advisors who supported confronting China thought taxing allies and sparking a global trade war was going too far. Legal pushback mounted in Washington, D.C., where major business lobbies prepared court challenges, arguing Trump overstepped his authority. Litigation would take time, and meanwhile, U.S. Customs was already collecting these tariffs at ports. The U.S. Treasury was raking in tariff money, which Trump touted as a way to reduce the federal deficit and balance the budget, a claim economists disputed. He had earlier said it was amazing how much revenue tariffs brought in. Short-term consequences. Liberation Day brought turmoil. It was arguably the biggest upheaval in trade policy since the 1930s. Immediate short-term consequences included price shocks. Importers had to decide whether to swallow the cost or pass it on. Many rushed shipments before tariffs fully kicked in on April 9th. After that, price tags rose in stores, fueling inflation just as it had begun to cool from 2024 levels. Supply disruptions. Some foreign suppliers suddenly found U.S. orders cancelled or postponed. American buyers were either negotiating discounts or switching to domestic sources. But switching isn't always easy, so certain niche products became scarce. European-made power tools, for example, might vanish from shelves. Retaliation pain. U.S. exporters got hit too. Farmers, who had just clawed back some sales to China, saw new orders halted. Ships carrying U.S. sorghum to China were turned away again. Boeing worried that China would steer big jet orders to Airbus. American tech companies like Apple, which manufactures in China, feared bureaucratic retaliation through slow customs clearance or consumer boycotts. Logistical rerouting. If all US-bound goods from China now faced 44% tariffs, some shippers considered routing goods through third countries with minor transformations. US Customs was on high alert for fraud. Ports in Mexico and Canada anticipated more volume, though rules of origin limited how much tariff avoidance was possible. If these Liberation Day tariffs persist, possible outcomes could include deeper decoupling. Many American companies may permanently move sourcing out of China. Some might reshore to the US entirely, creating manufacturing jobs at home, but often involving automation. Others will go to alternative countries. Either way, reliance on China will drop significantly. Economic efficiency versus security. Less global efficiency means higher costs, but proponents argue it increases resilience. It's a trade-off between cheaper goods and reduced dependence on rivals. Global trading system. Realignment. We might see formal or informal trading blocs form. The US could strike one-off deals with allies for exemptions, returning to a hub-and-spoke system. This harkens back to 19th century style protectionism. WTO irrelevance. If the largest economy flouts the most favored nation principle and gets away with it, others may do the same. The result could be a power-based rather than rules-based system, with smaller countries aligning with big blocs or risking isolation. Phase 2 or negotiations. Maybe it's a gambit for a new grand deal. Trump might hope maximum pressure forces concessions, especially from China. History suggests trade wars are easier to start than to end, so if economic pain grows, both sides might seek an exit ramp. Alternatively, domestic pressure could push Congress to intervene if a recession looms. Liberation Day marks a critical point of no return. Observers see it as the culmination of a long shift away from championing globalization and toward dismantling it. Now that we have the full timeline and the current situation, we can evaluate who gained, who lost, and what are the arguments on each side, and where does this conflict ultimately lead? Welcome to Chapter 9 of our series on the US-China trade war. Today, we're asking a critical question: was it worth it? The trade war has been costly and contentious, but did it achieve any benefits, and for whom? In this episode, we'll evaluate the pros and cons for the key players, primarily the United States and China, and also consider its impact on the rest of the world. Raised awareness and confronted China's practices. The trade war put a spotlight on issues like intellectual property theft, forced tech transfer, and state subsidies in China. It forced both US companies and allies to acknowledge these problems. Some argue that without the shock of tariffs, the world might have continued tolerating unfair trade imbalances. Now even Democrats and US allies largely agree on the need to be firm with China. In that sense, the hard line taken changed the global conversation about China's trade behavior. Robert Lighthizer, as the United States Trade Representative, claimed victory in highlighting that existing World Trade Organization (WTO) rules were inadequate for dealing with China's practices, and indeed, the WTO was shown to be largely powerless in restraining either China's tech mercantilism or the US's unilateral tariffs. Some leverage and partial deals. Tariffs brought China to the negotiating table, resulting in the Phase 1 deal. While far from perfect, it did prompt China to purchase more US goods, especially agriculture, than it likely would have otherwise, and led to some written commitments on intellectual property and financial market openings. These steps, though limited, were arguably more than previous administrations achieved. Today, continuing tariffs remain a bargaining chip for further negotiations. The US hasn't removed them, using them as pressure for unresolved issues. However, this card in hand hurts the US itself when fully played. Protecting certain industries. Tariffs protected some US sectors from import competition. Domestic steelmakers benefited from higher prices and increased market share. The US solar panel manufacturing sector also saw growth after tariffs on imported panels, though installers paid more. Some farmers benefited indirectly from China's forced purchases in the Phase 1 deal. For example, cotton and grain exports to China rose in 2020 to 2021. By 2025, with broader tariffs, American producers in direct competition with imports can have a home market price advantage. An Ohio foundry owner even reported a surge in orders when Chinese metal parts were tariffed, allowing him to hire more workers. Protecting certain industries. Tariffs protected some US sectors from import competition. Domestic steelmakers benefited from higher prices and increased market share. The US solar panel manufacturing sector also saw growth after tariffs on imported panels, though installers paid more. Some farmers benefited indirectly from China's forced purchases in the Phase 1 deal. For example, cotton and grain exports to China rose in 2020 to 21. By 2025, with broader tariffs, American producers in direct competition with imports can have a home market price advantage. An Ohio foundry owner even reported a surge in orders when Chinese metal parts were tariffed, allowing him to hire more workers. Tariff revenue. The US Treasury collected tens of billions of dollars from the China-specific tariffs between 2018 and 2022. Although economists note importers and consumers effectively foot the bill, it still counts as revenue flowing into government coffers. By 2025, with the blanket tariffs, 10% on over $3 trillion of imports, the potential revenue could exceed $70 billion annually. This has fueled ideas of using tariff income to reduce other taxes, a populist notion of shifting the tax burden from domestic production to imported goods. Economists warn, however, that tariffs can shrink overall economic activity, thus lowering other tax bases. Strategic decoupling and security advocates say reducing reliance on an authoritarian rival makes America safer in the long run. Shortening supply chains could prevent a scenario where China withholds critical goods in a future conflict. During COVID, the US learned the importance of domestic production for essential items like PPE. The trade war effectively forced a reckoning with overdependence on China and spurred bipartisan efforts to rebuild certain industries, exemplified by the CHIPS Act that supports domestic semiconductor production. Psychological political win for some communities, blue-collar regions hollowed out by factory closures felt heard. Whether or not it meaningfully restored jobs, there was a sense of justice in punishing what many believed to be unfair Chinese trade practices. Politically, this changed the landscape, showing that a populist stance on trade resonates with voters, influencing policy beyond one administration. Higher consumer prices and inflation tariffs act like a sales tax on imports, with American consumers and businesses bearing most of the cost. Research showed tariffs on Chinese goods led to direct price increases in the US economy. Although the pandemic was the primary driver of 2021-22 inflation, tariffs likely added around 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points to core inflation. With the broad Liberation Day tariffs introduced in 2025, household costs could rise substantially more, tripling or even quadrupling the extra yearly burden for many families. Retaliation harmed US exporters. American farmers, manufacturers, and service providers lost market share in China due to retaliatory tariffs. Some farm states needed massive government bailouts as exports like soybeans, pork, and farm equipment faced Chinese barriers. Multinational companies struggled with consumer boycotts in China. For instance, a dip in iPhone sales in 2019 was partly attributed to patriotic buying of Huawei phones instead. Tourism and education also suffered as fewer Chinese travelers and students arrived in the US. Manufacturing didn't fully revive. Despite protection for some industries, overall US manufacturing job gains were modest before the pandemic, and then many were lost in 2020. Automation and higher costs for imported components made certain American factories less competitive. Indeed, some major manufacturers paused investment due to the uncertainty created by ongoing tariff threats. A notable analysis concluded that the trade war actually lowered US manufacturing output and employment relative to what it might have been otherwise. Strained alliances and lost goodwill tariffs on steel and aluminum from US allies, plus the sweeping 2025 tariffs, soured relationships with partners like the EU, Canada, and others. Counter-tariffs on American exports led to tensions and a sense that the US was abandoning the rules-based global trading system it once championed. This has long-term implications for US leadership, particularly when seeking allied cooperation on broader strategic matters. Legal and institutional damage. Washington's unilateral approach undermined the WTO system. The US blocked appointments to the WTO appellate body, crippling dispute resolution. Other countries may now feel justified in imposing their own retaliatory measures for national security, creating a risk of escalating tit-for-tat tariffs worldwide. Domestically, some worry about the precedent of using emergency powers to bypass Congress for trade measures, economic inefficiency and growth loss. By diverting global trade away from its most efficient paths, tariffs reduce overall productivity and raise costs. Estimates suggest the cumulative effect trimmed US GDP by up to 1% over a few years. Lower investment due to uncertainty and more expensive imported capital goods further hindered growth. Many economists argue that the net effect was negative sum, with both countries and the global economy worse off. Trade deficit irony. The US trade deficit with China initially dropped but then re-emerged, while deficits with other countries surged. American demand for imports did not disappear. It simply shifted to nations like Vietnam, Mexico, and others. Although bilateral deficits shifted around, the overall US goods deficit hit record highs in 2021-2022, underscoring that tariffs alone do not control trade imbalances driven by deeper macroeconomic factors like saving and investment patterns. Wake-up call to reduce dependence on US markets. Tech. The trade war accelerated China's push for self-reliance. Beijing increased support for domestic tech development and introduced a dual circulation strategy to boost internal consumption and innovation. Losing access to certain US technologies prodded Chinese firms like Huawei to develop their own alternatives, such as operating systems and semiconductor processes. Diversification of export markets. Facing US barriers, China turned more aggressively to other regions. Trade with Southeast Asia rose significantly, and China signed new agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Europe also became a larger market for Chinese electronics and electric vehicles. This diversification reduced Beijing's reliance on US demand. Political rally-round-the-flag effect, externally imposed pressure, allowed the Chinese Communist Party to invoke nationalism and unite the public against perceived foreign bullying. China refused to dismantle its economic model, refusing any major concession on core issues like state subsidies. Domestically, that stance bolstered the image of a strong leadership. Limited economic hit relative to worst-case fears, China's GDP growth did slow, but not catastrophically. Stimulus measures and a weaker yuan offset some tariff impacts. By 2021, Chinese exports rebounded to record levels due to global demand for pandemic-related goods. While it did not escape unscathed, China demonstrated resilience under significant external pressure, maintained strategic subsidies and plans. The trade war did not force China to abandon key industrial policies. State-backed support for electric vehicles, aerospace, and semiconductors continued. The Phase 1 deal did not address these core structural concerns, allowing Beijing to keep advancing its state-led development model. Cons: economic and reputational hit. Economic losses and slower growth exports to the US dropped, and some foreign companies shifted production out of China. Many small and medium manufacturers faced lower orders or shut down, especially in export hubs like Guangdong. This added to employment worries and required further credit-based stimulus, fueling debt concerns. Loss of US market share and tech access. China's portion of US imports dipped from around 22% in 2017 to about 17% by 2022. Chinese companies found it difficult to recapture retail shelf space lost to competitors. On the tech front, firms like Huawei lost access to advanced US semiconductors, crippling certain global product lines and adding years to domestic research and development efforts. Capital flight and reduced foreign investment. Heightened political risk pushed some foreign investors and multinational corporations to hedge their bets by moving facilities to other countries. Foreign direct investment into Chinese manufacturing slowed, and wealthier Chinese individuals moved capital overseas, anticipating more tension or currency depreciation. Reputational damage and distrust. Accusations of backtracking during negotiations and failing to fully meet Phase 1 purchase commitments, even accounting for the pandemic, hurt China's credibility with some trade partners. Retaliatory tariffs also affected Chinese consumers directly, raising domestic prices on certain US imports like agricultural goods. Lagging in advanced technologies. By losing access to cutting-edge US and allied technology, China's path to top-tier innovation is more difficult. Huawei's smartphone business shrank without advanced chips, and domestic semiconductor fabricators are racing to catch up without key foreign equipment. Short-term, this setback could erode competitiveness in fields like artificial intelligence and 5G device manufacturing. Social stability concerns. If large export hubs lose competitiveness, unemployment could rise and cause unrest, always a concern for Beijing. While they have contained fallout so far, a deeper and prolonged decoupling might strain social cohesion in regions dependent on export-oriented factory work. Mixed bag of winners and losers. Winners. Countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Mexico and Canada gained diverted export orders once heading to China or the US. Vietnam in particular saw a surge of foreign-invested factories. Europe briefly benefited when China lowered some tariffs on European goods to substitute for US imports. Losers. Commodity exporters suffered when global growth slowed. Export-heavy economies like Germany and the EU endured a manufacturing slump. Global business confidence took a hit, halving trade growth by some estimates. Emerging markets sometimes faced currency volatility as investors sought safer assets amidst trade tension. Strain on multilateral systems. With the WTO weakened and major powers taking unilateral actions, smaller nations worry about having no legal recourse if hit by protectionist measures. Some middle powers are now pivoting to regional or bilateral pacts, an ongoing realignment of global trade. Overall, the trade war's cons, instability, inefficiency, inflationary pressures, and higher political risk, likely outweighed the pros, which include pressuring China to address certain issues, generating tariff revenue, and reshaping supply chains away from reliance on a single market. However, it did create new realities, a broader consensus on the need to confront China's trade practices, a pivot towards self-reliance in Beijing, and a more fragmented global trade environment that considers geopolitics as much as profit. In our next episode, we'll look at the long-term policy shifts triggered by this conflict, from industrial policy and security strategies to the changing global alliances in a world where trade is more than just economics. Welcome to Chapter 10 of our series on the US-China trade war. After this eventful journey from 2017 to 2025, where are we headed? The conflict, now intensified by the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, seems to herald a new era in world trade, an era where two economic superpowers engage in partial decoupling, and the global economy potentially splits into blocks, something we might call economic bifurcation. Will we see renewed decoupling? Almost certainly yes, and on a bigger scale. The unwinding of intertwined supply chains is no longer a hypothetical. It's happening. Liberation Day tariffs may force companies that held out so far to finally move production. It's plausible that in a few years the phrase "made in China for America" becomes rare, with most mass-market goods for the US produced in Mexico, Vietnam, India, or domestically. Conversely, China might source key components only from domestic or non-US suppliers, even at the expense of efficiency. The world could start to resemble a dual circulation system on a global scale, one orbit of countries trading mostly within a US-centric framework, and another orbit within a China-centric framework with limited exchange between them. Some economists describe this as a fragmentation into two trading blocks, each with its own tech standards, payment systems, and supply networks. Is a Phase 2 deal possible? Phase 2 was supposed to tackle the hard issues, China's subsidies, state firms, cybersecurity, and more. Trust between the US and China is at rock bottom. China is unlikely to negotiate under open tariff pressure, and the US, already imposing massive tariffs, would insist on major concessions. In the near term, a Phase 2 deal looks unlikely. Perhaps if both sides experience mutual economic pain by 2026, they might resume talks quietly. But many observers note that the trade war did not solve the underlying concerns and even intensified strategic rivalry. Phase 2 would require deep compromise, China altering its development model, and the US removing tariffs and perhaps tolerating some elements of managed trade. That vision seems distant. Optimists speculate maybe after the 2028 US election, if leadership changes or global pressure rises, there could be a grand bargain. Yet given current geopolitical competition, a continued stalemate seems more likely. A deeper economic bifurcation, partial rather than complete, may be the most realistic scenario. We could see a clear tech split, one ecosystem using Chinese 5G, Beidou navigation, and Alibaba cloud services, while another relies on Western 5G providers, GPS, and Amazon or Microsoft. In finance, China and Russia might conduct more trade in yuan, while the West relies on dollars and euros. This rift could extend to academic collaboration, research, and data flows, especially if tighter visa restrictions and decoupling continue to limit knowledge exchange. Is this new Cold War in economics sustainable or desirable? On one hand, competition can spur innovation. Think of historic rivalries like the space race. On the other hand, dividing the global economy can slow overall growth and innovation by duplicating efforts and cutting off the synergy that comes from open collaboration. A world where the US and China barely cooperate on trade can also hinder progress on pressing global issues like climate change, which demands international collaboration and technology sharing. As engaged analytical listeners, we can see that the US-China trade war was never just about tariffs or soybeans. It was, and remains, about the terms of globalization and the balance of power in the 21st century. The period from 2017 to 2025 may be remembered as the end of one era, the post-Cold War free trade consensus, and the start of a more fragmented era. In effect, tariffs soared to levels not seen in over a century, building a wall of protection around the US. For those who support such measures, it's about independence and strength. For free traders, it's a worrying rollback of global integration. Where do we go from here? One possibility is that this conflict stabilizes into an uneasy truce, a managed disengagement without a complete rupture. Another is that economic logic and lobbying eventually compel a rollback of some tariffs to restore growth. There's also a scenario where a global crisis forces the US and China to cooperate again, out of necessity, easing tensions. But the old status quo is gone. We are now in a new normal of rivalry, and that distrust extends beyond trade into technology, security, and ideology. For businesses and workers worldwide, navigating this decoupling will be a major challenge. Some will find opportunities amid shifting supply chains, while others will be forced to choose sides or duplicate operations. Consumers might face fewer cheap goods, but perhaps more domestic job openings in certain industries. In the end, the story of the US-China trade war shows how decades of global interdependence can be unwound much faster than they were built, and not without pain or unintended consequences. Will this lead to a fairer, more secure system, or a poorer, more divided world? The jury is still out. One online commentator suggested we might look back in 20 years and see this as the moment the globalization wave crested and rolled back. Another speculated it might just be a detour before pragmatism returns when the costs of decoupling become apparent. As of 2025, we're living through this detour. Whether it becomes the new path or we find our way back to collaboration will shape the future for decades to come. Thank you for tuning in to this deep dive. Stay with us for future episodes as we continue tracking the seismic shifts in geopolitics and economics. Until next time, I'm your host, signing off. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the US-China trade war, a story filled with real, data-driven insights that you won't find on ordinary news channels. Stay tuned for our next episode, where the K Show will continue to deliver extraordinary perspectives and untold details that matter for our future. If you have any questions on the US-China trade war or tariffs, send an email to K via the Sidebeats channel. We truly appreciate your support and curiosity. Stay informed and take care.